All right, good morning, everyone. Jessica Riles here with the University of Florida IFAS Extension in Collier County. I have a very exciting presenter for you today. We are super happy to have Dr. Jonathan Crane with us from the Tropical Research and Education Center over in Homestead. They are a research center down in the Redlands and do a lot of really interesting research and extension work. But Dr. Crane's specialty is in tropical fruit. And he is our premier tropical fruit and mango expert with the University of Florida. So we're very excited to have him. His background is in extension and research. And so Dr. Crane, I'll let you talk more about what you do. But welcome. I know we'll have a lot of excited people today in the crowd to hear what you have to say about mango production. So I will hand it over to you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for the kind words. And yeah, I'm glad to be here. As Jessica mentioned, I'm at the Tropical Research and Education Center in Homestead. It's a 160-acre working research farm. We have 17 faculty, and we work on fruits, vegetables, ornamentals, and natural resources. And so this morning, I'm going to talk to you. I'm gearing this talk towards mango growing in the home landscape. And so hopefully this will be of use to you wherever you're located down there. So let me go to the next one. Okay. So I think most of you know mangoes are in the Anacardiaceae family. And that mangoes are indigenous to India and Southeast Asia. They were first recorded, introduction into Florida was about 1833. And, you know, mangoes are really been distributed throughout the subtropical and tropical world. In fact, it's actually grown in some more warm temperate areas in protected culture, such as in Japan and parts of China. There's two major types, the Indian types, which have monoembryonic seeds. So that means there's one embryo in the seed. And the fruit tends to be highly colored fruit. And then there are the Indonesian types, which are have polyembryonic seeds, which means they have more than one embryo in the seeds. The fruit are commonly green or yellowish colored fruit. And why is that important? With monoembryonic type varieties or cultivars of mango, the only way to propagate those and continue to get the same variety is by vegetative propagation, grafting, or budding, something like that. In contrast, the polyembryonic types, you can grow them from seed. There is a chance that you would actually get a hybrid and not the exact copy of of the mother plant. And that's because these seeds have multiple embryos, but sometimes one of those embryos is actually zygotic, or what I mean is actually the cross from the mother and the father, so it's a hybrid. However, the other seedlings from that one seed would be identical to the mother. And usually the seedling, so if you plant a polyembryonic seed, and let's say 5 seedlings come up from that one seed, probably the most vigorous of those 5 shoots is actually the hybrid, the one from the cross of the mother and the father. The other 4 will probably be identical to the mother. Okay. There are many cultivars and hybrids that have occurred because they will naturally cross-pollinate. So that's very common. Okay, so a little bit of the tree description and the flower morphology. You guys know that trees can get to be quite large unless they're pruned. Generally evergreen. The flowers are born on large inflorescences, you're all familiar with. Here's a picture of the flowers. They're very small. There are 2 types of flowers. There are staminate or male flowers. So in that picture, it wouldn't have the ovary, the female part. And then there are perfect flowers, which have stamens and the ovary completely. And this is a perfect flower that I'm showing you here. And you can see, you know, the stigma, the style, the ovary. Here's the male part. Here's the anther and the filament. here's a staminoid, and this is an anther that's non-functional. It doesn't dehisce pollen. And then this is the nectary disc. And then here's petals and sepals. So what are they pollinated by? So mango flowers are pollinated by flies, thrips, and honeybees. And probably more common are flies than honeybees. Okay, the fruit is technically a drupe. It's got a single large seed. Obviously, you've seen that before. The fruit shape, color, and size varies with variety. This happens to be Irwin. Okay, so I've already explained this thing about the monoembryonic seeds and the polyembryonic seeds previously. And this you can look at later on for more detail. Okay, caution statement. There are some people that are allergic to the mango plant sap or latex, and they will develop a dermatitis similar to poison ivy. And so this sap actually, can come from the leaves, from the stems, from the fruit peel. And so people who do have a sensitivity to this, should wear long sleeve shirts and latex gloves, or have somebody else harvest the fruit and cut the fruit open for them. There are some people that are actually allergic to the pulp. So if somebody has never had mango, they should, just take a little bit and just wait a little bit and make sure they don't have an allergic reaction. Okay. Mango trees are well adapted to lowland tropical areas, and these are areas that actually temperatures rarely drop, let's say, below about 60 degrees, generally, or more like 65, 68. They are also well adapted to subtropical areas, such as South Florida. They are sensitive to freezing temperatures, and young trees can be damaged or killed once the temperatures get 29, 30 degrees. Mature trees can usually withstand cooler temperatures, maybe down to 25 degrees. And these are trees that are not protected by any mechanism. These are just trees in a landscape, let's say. It has been shown that citrus trees can actually acclimate to colder temperatures. So if they're exposed to cold, non-freezing temperatures, it actually makes them more cold hardy. Mango trees, this doesn't occur. And so far, there's not been any real data to show there's a significant difference in the cold resistance among mango varieties. And we get this question a lot, can I grow a cold hardy mango variety? And we really haven't found one that you could really say is cold hardy. Okay. So to talk about the panicle or flower induction. So here are some of the requirements and environmental conditions. And there's really 3 factors that are necessary for flowering. You need mature terminal shoots that are dormant. So these are the shoots where the leaves are hardened off and they're not growing. Okay, so it's dormant. Then exposure to cool, non-freezing temperatures. And in our case, it would be some temperatures below about 59 degrees. And how long? Well, in some cases, it depends on in all cases, it depends on the variety, really. So something like Edwards, maybe with as little as 3 weeks of cool temperatures, excuse me, they'll go ahead and flower once things start to warm up a little bit. Whereas something like Kit or Tommy Atkins, you're looking at, more than a month. And in some varieties, maybe even up to 3 months. So it does vary by variety. But this exposure to cool, non-freezing temperatures is really what's happening in our climate. Also, if dry weather helps to make the trees dormant as well. It's generally not the dormant factor here, whereas temperature is. Excuse me. But it helps, having dry conditions helps to make the trees dormant. And then subsequently, when the temperatures start to warm, that's when the tree expresses the flowering, right? And you see here, the length of time to exposure to cool temperatures varies as short as 14, as long as 5 months. And I already mentioned drought helps, and those are the main factors setting up a tree being able to flower. Okay. Talk a little bit more about flowers and the flowering. So the base temperature for flowering in subtropical climates is about 53 to 59 degrees. So that's what I mean by it warms up. So once it gets up into the 60s, the flowering commences rapidly. Okay. There's also a change, and this can be based on the genetics of the tree, but also from year to year variation. There's a proportion of male to perfect flowers, and it varies. It varies with the temperatures during the flowering period, but also by variety. Okay. And here I mentioned that temperatures below about 39 to 41 during the flowering results in reduced pollen viability and fruit set. In contrast, very high temperatures, let's say above 91, also can reduce the viability of the pollen. So, and also these other temperatures here, below 54 or high above 110 can result in ovule abortion. And then you end up with these parthenocarpic fruit, which don't really stay on the tree and don't develop. This past year, the mango season, we can attribute this poor season to exposure of the trees to temperatures below 45 during January. There was a period in there that we had, at least in this area, had over 30 hours, about 30 hours of cool temperatures. And that coincided perfectly with the flowering and ended up killing and damaging most of the flowers. And so we had very little fruit set this year. Excuse me. Rootstocks. So most of the time, the commercial nurseries are using these polyembryonic seedlings. Some of them are turpentine, number 11. Others we would call criollo types. They're similar to turpentine. And they may be from trees here, or they bring them in from offshore. And why use polyembryonic seedlings? Partly because they're vigorous, and partly because they're more uniform, right? And so you want the trees, let's say you're growing Valencia Pride, and you're growing more than one tree. If you're using an open, a monoembryonic seedling, one of the trees may be vigorous and produce very well. The other one may not be thrifty and grow well because they're genetically different. With the seedlings, all the seedling rootstocks are the same. So hence the potential that the vigor and the performance of the scion, or the top of the tree, would be similar. Okay. These rootstocks are adapted to our calcareous soil and high pH soil. And you see there, they can be grafted. There's different ways. There's veneer grafts, cleft grafts, patch or tea budding. Also, mature trees can be top worked to new varieties if that's so desired. It's not really common. It is done commercially to some extent, but in the dooryard, really not done much. And there are at least 600 mango varieties in Florida. We're really lucky to have quite a few large collections of mangoes. The USDA Subtropical Horticultural Research Station in Miami has a very large collection, probably 300 to 400 varieties. Fairchild Tropical Botanical Garden has probably 300-400 varieties. We've got about 180. Fruit and Spice Park, probably 180 as well. So there's a lot of varieties in South Florida. However, in the commercial trade, you're not going to see 180 varieties available, but quite a few, probably 30 plus varieties. So there's a lot of choice out there from the nurseries, actually. Generally, we recommend planting the mangoes. Well, not planting. Our mango season ranges from May through September, depending on the variety you're growing. And one of the advantages of growing mangoes in your home landscape is you don't have to pick all the fruit at the same time. So if normally in a commercial sense, most of the fruit is picked over a 2-week period in June, you actually can have fruit through the latter part of June and maybe even into July, because you're only picking a few fruit at a time. Okay, I'm going to just go through quickly some of the varieties that are available. And as I said, we're not going to go through 600 varieties. We're just going to talk a little bit about some of the varieties that are available to everyone. And so we don't have to read all this. And so Tommy Atkins. Now this one, it is very productive. It is moderately disease resistant. It's a vigorous tree. It's not a tree you can keep small easily. However, the pulp is not that desired. It's not that great in flavor. It also has fibers, but it is a very productive tree. Kit is also a very moderately vigorous tree. Good to excellent pulp quality. This one is sort of a dual purpose. This fruit is actually grown for its green fruit, so immature fruit, about halfway grown, and it's eaten like an apple. So that's one way. Then you can allow the fruit to mature and eat it fresh. So it's sort of a dual purpose. It is a moderately vigorous tree, but this is one that's grown commercially as well. Kent, this is also productive. It's a vigorous tree, has excellent fruit quality. And when I talk about vigorous trees and non-vigorous trees, the vigorous trees are ones that you would do selective pruning to try to maintain the size of the tree somewhere below. In the home landscape, I would suggest somewhere 15 feet or lower. But you would need to prune them because these trees are vigorous and can get very large very quickly. Here's Van Dyke. This is another one that's an old, these are some of these old time varieties. Not really, this one's not grown commercially. It's a smaller fruit than the other ones I've just shown you. Palmer, this is an old time one too. Moderately productive, good quality pulp. And you can see the harvest dates vary on some of these varieties. And I know it's saying July, August, and that's because it depends on the year, on how rapidly the fruit develop and mature. So it's not easy to just peg it and say, oh, July 1st to July 15th. Irwin is another, again, moderately vigorous, harvested June, July. Glen, this is a good, the fruit production is fair to good. It does have susceptibility to anthracnose, but it is moderately low to moderate tree vigor, so it's easier to prune and maintain its size. Excellent fruit pulp quality, and it's a relatively early variety, June, July. Hayden, this is an old time favorite. The production varies. It is sensitive to cool temperatures, susceptible to anthracnose. It is a vigorous tree. A lot of people love the flavor of this, and it's a relatively early June, July. Valencia Pride, this is a vigorous tree, large fruit. It is susceptible to anthracnose and harvested, July, August. Ruby is a small fruit, moderately vigorous tree, generally good fruit production. Floragon, this one is a moderately vigorous tree as well. Pulp good to excellent quality, harvested June, July. So one thing you want to think about is this susceptibility to anthracnose. So if it's highly susceptible, you probably don't want to plant it because anthracnose is a big problem in South Florida because of our wet, rainy, high relative humidity weather. So you might want to look for ones that have some tolerance or less susceptibility to anthracnose because anthracnose attacks the flowers and also the fruit. Saigon, again, good quality fruit. June, July, you can see this is a yellow peeled type. Namdok Mai, fair to good fruit production, excellent pulp quality, again, moderately susceptible. Oak Grong, another vigorous tree. Carabao, this was a major variety in the Philippines, a moderately vigorous tree, moderately susceptible to anthracnose. So what's new and what's old that's new and new that's new? So you'll see what I mean as we go through some of these. This is young. It's also called Edward times Kent 14 or Tebow, sometimes sold under the name Tebow. And here you'll see, I talk about the flavor, the fiber, the production, the disease resistance, post-harvest, season, market, and tree vigor. And so this is actually was selected quite a long time ago, but has only become more popular in the past 10 years or so. Angie, this is one that was named more recently. It's being grown commercially and in the dooryard. It's got excellent flavor, low fiber. The production is not really documented, but it seems to be okay. It's an early variety. It's a low vigor tree, which means it's manageable by pruning. And that's what I mean by that, tree and then low vigor, manageable. Malika, this is also has excellent flavor. You have to harvest this one. It's a little bit tricky. You want to harvest it about 7 to 14 days before you think it's really mature, because it goes ahead and finishes maturing and ripening basically off the tree. The season is mid, and it's a moderately vigorous tree. This is more vigorous than Angie. Raposa, also this is a vigorous tree. It's originally this is a selection from Hawaii. Excellent flavor, production is good. Season mid to late season. Coggeshall, this is a low vigor compact tree, especially if you're pruning it, selectively pruning it to maintain a smaller size. Production tends to be pretty good. Season early to mid season. Maha Chinook, flavor is excellent, low fiber. Post-harvest, well, not post-harvest, but post-harvest is fair to good. In other words, it's not going to store a long time. The tree is moderately vigorous, but it's a really nice fruit. Poo Calais or lemon meringue, you'll see it sold under both of those names. The flavor is very good. Production tends to be low to moderate. It's moderately vigorous tree. Okay, here's some other newer ones. This one's called Lemon Zest. There's a series of varieties that have been released by Zill's High Performance Nursery. And Gary Zill is the owner of that. And here I have a little bit about, it's a mid-season and the quality of, or comments on the fruit. And so Lemon Zest is one, coconut cream, excellent flavor, moderately vigorous tree. Some of these are new, so there's not a lot of information on, how productive they are. And so, you might be taking a chance, but it might be a really good chance. I mean, I like both of these actually. Sweet Tart is another one, mid-season. It's got a strong flavor if you're looking for that. Peach Cobbler, excellent fruit quality. This is a mid to late season, July, August. Rosy Gold. This is one of excellent quality. It's a low vigor, easily managed tree. You're looking at early season, sometime between March and July, and I know that's a large range, but it depends on the weather conditions during leading up to the flowering season and during fruit development. Manageable tree. Juliet, this one is a mid-season. The fruit is similar to Julie, and the tree is moderately vigorous. Early Gold, this is an early season, excellent quality, moderately vigorous tree. Ugly Betty, it's a mid-season, excellent flavor, but low production. Harvest Moon, you see the comments there about it's a large, excellent fruit, mid-season to late. Pickering, this one was selected by Walter Zill. It's early, so June, July, it's productive. It's a low vigor tree, manageable, and the fruit quality is only considered fair, but it is early. Pineapple Pleasure, excellent flavor. It's not really productive, but sometimes Having a few fruit of excellent quality is better than having a whole lot of fruit that's not very good. This one is Orange Essence. This is excellent flavor. It's a mid-season fruit. Pina Colada. This is a tree with low vigor. It's got small, strong flavored fruit. Tart-like fruit. And then Fairchild. This tree has low tree vigor. It's compact. It's manageable. It's got good quality. So I'm going to talk a little bit about alternatives to kit, which I mentioned earlier can be used as a green fruit. So there are people who like to eat mangoes that are green and hard and crunchy, not soft. And so kit, as I mentioned, is sold as a green fruit. And so these are some alternatives if you like to have fruit that way. So Furlan is one. Nam Dak Mai is another. And I just to go back, Furlan really is good as a green fruit. It really has a really nice flavor. Nam Dak Mai is another one. Kyo Savoy, and actually, in some cases, people have used Valencia Pride as green fruit. So let's talk a little bit about soil conditions. They're considered moderately tolerant of wet soils. This basically means they can generally withstand, some periodic flooding or soil saturation that lasts for a number of days. However, if it's, continuously wet or flooded, especially young trees, they may decline and die. The older trees may just sort of hold on. They're not going to be happy about being in wet conditions, but they may get through it. So we really do recommend, people should only plant trees in well-drained areas that don't flood, obviously. You can, if you're in an area that might get wet or stay excessively wet or flooded, you can build a mound and plant the tree up on this mound. The mound can be anywhere from 6 to 3 feet high, 6 inches to 3 feet high. And I would suggest making the mound out of the same type soil that's in that location. I wouldn't recommend bringing in a truckload of topsoil. And that's because of the effect of the different soil textures on the way water moves through the soil. Nutrition. So, you want to begin with just very small amounts, about every other month, and then you increase it as the trees get larger. And we have a fact sheet on mango production in the home landscape, and it has a chart in there where it gives you some rough guidelines as to how much fertilizer and when to apply it. The other thing too is micronutrients. So these are minor elements that are needed in small amounts. In our area in particular, applying these to the leaves 3 or 4 times a year is a good idea. And you can buy these micronutrient mixes either from a garden store or online, and just follow the directions and spray it on the leaves. For iron in our calcareous soils, where we have very high pH and a lot of calcium in the soil, we'd recommend using a form of iron that's called EDDHA. It's a chelated iron. There's a brand called Sequestrine 138. There are another one that's made by Miller. The main thing is that the chelate is EDDHA, which allows that iron to be available for the roots to take up. And basically you mix it with water and just pour it around the base of the tree for the roots to get into the soil solution, and the roots can take it up. The other thing too is, mangoes are really a low nitrogen type tree. So you want to avoid high rates of nitrogen application really anytime during the year. Why? Because high nitrogen, excessive nitrogen fertilization of mango trees has shown that they just tend to grow vegetatively much more often and not go dormant and get set up for flowering and fruiting. The other thing too is high nitrogen tends to reduce the quality of the fruit, makes it more susceptible to anthracnose, but also to internal breakdown of the pulp. So you want to avoid high nitrogen, a lot of nitrogen applications. Okay. So we also talk about applying the fertilizers, the timing. So in general, because they are a tropical, subtropical tree, their activity in taking up nutrients is going to be greater during what we would call the growing season, sometime between March and September. So they're not able to take up, especially the minor elements, as easily during December, January, and February. So if you're applying them during that time, the tree may not react to them very much because it's incapable of taking it up because the tree is basically dormant, right? Also, the best time to apply the foliar nutrients is when the new leaves it's flushing out new leaves are about halfway grown. If you miss that, that's okay. I'm just saying that tends to be more effective. And then again, applying the iron sometime between April through September, it would be more effective. Remember, when you're applying fertilizers, whether it's to the leaves or to the soil, if we're having, 1, 2, 3+ inches of rain, you need to take a look at the weather and what the predictions are and try to avoid, super high rainfall periods, because it's either washing the nutrients off the leaves or it's flushing it past where the roots are. So you want to watch for that as well. You can use mulch with mango trees. Just a few cautions about that is you want the mulch to be at least 6 inches, 12 inches. I have here 2 to 4 inches away from the base of the trunk. Why? Because if you have the mulch up against the trunk, it can be excessively wet and you might get some rotting along the base of the tree. So you can use, 2 to 6 inches of clean mulch out to the drip line, but just keep it a little bit away from the trunks and reapply as needed. It will reduce the weed pressure. One thing you can do if you want to is when you're going to fertilize your tree is pull the mulch back, apply your fertilizer, and then put the mulch back. That's one strategy. You want to be sure that the tree is getting the nutrients and not all the microbes that are in that mulch layer. Okay, spacing. So remember I was talking about the vigor of the trees, and so it really depends on how vigorous the tree is. And that's why I was saying in the home landscape, if you don't have a lot of room, you're going to want to use one of the non-vigorous types. Annual pruning is really a must to keep the trees somewhere, as I said, somewhere below 15 feet. However, vigorous cultivars that may not be pruned. So if some people, they'll plant a tree and they don't have any plans to prune them or control their size, they really need to be 25, 30 feet away from all structures and other trees. The non-vigorous cultivars can be planted somewhat closer, and you never want to plant trees near electrical lines. For the first 2 years after planting, you want to remove any weak or crossed, poorly placed limbs, limbs with narrow crotch angles. And one thing that really is beneficial is to head back long shoots. So you pinch or you tip prune the shoots. So it'll put out 1 or 2 flushes. So 1 flush, 2 flush, then you tip that, and it forces the tree to branch. And this will encourage the branching and encourage a tree that's more compact. And also remember, since the fruit is produced on the ends of the branches, the more ends of branches you have, the more potential fruit, right? Later on, as the tree develops year 3, 4+, you can prune to thin out the inner canopy. And this will open it up to more light and air penetration. But it will also, by heading the tree back or maintaining the size of the tree somewhere below 15 feet, you can help maintain the canopy on the sides of the tree and have your fruit production from the ground up, right? I'm sure all of you have seen old mango trees where the first fruit starts at about 8 or 9 feet above the soil, and that's because the lower limbs have been lost, because the lower limbs are lost when they're shaded, when the tree shades its own limbs for a long period of time, it drops those lower limbs. By pruning the tree and maintaining it so that it gets full light exposure, you will be maintaining that side of the canopy and have fruit production from the bottom of the canopy upward. Okay. And so I've already mentioned this, but to maintain that lower side canopy and reduce wind damage, this is another reason you want to prune and keep the trees relatively small, is because of hurricanes and tropical storms. The taller your tree, the more likely it is to be pushed over or pulled out of the ground. And so you really need to maintain, I'm saying 15 feet here, I put 18 feet. I'm being generous. I really would or encourage something like 15 feet. And, you know, we generally recommend pruning trees immediately after you're done harvesting and removing these excessively vigorous limbs. But really, anytime from March through August, if you have a limb that's, you know, excessively vigorous and just going to the sky, and usually there's limbs that aren't producing any fruit anyway, you can selectively remove that limb. And I already mentioned that, you know, the pruning increases light penetration and air movement, helps reduce disease incidence of both the flowers and the fruit. Okay, watering. So newly planted trees should be watered quite frequently until they get established. And then again, probably for the first 3, 4, maybe even more, if we have excessively and prolonged dry conditions for these younger trees, right? However, as the trees are mature, they really don't need to be watered as much. And you want to avoid getting the foliage wet, right? Because that just enhances disease problems. And really the most critical time to water, if you do need to water, would be from flowering through harvest. So, you know, severe drought, if we're having severe drought conditions during the period you've got fruit, you should go ahead and water occasionally. Otherwise, you know, you might drop the fruit and have small fruit or not much fruit, right? Okay. And during the winter, in general, the trees don't need to be watered, just occasionally if it really is needed. Remember, the trees are slowing down, they're going dormant. You want them to go dormant so that they receive the signal to switch over to flowering in the spring. And of course, excessive watering can end up with root rots and tree declines. So biggest issue with, and this is commercially, but also in the dooryard, are 2 diseases, anthracnose, which attacks the panicles and the flowers and the fruit, and is really common during, you know, when we have high humidity, which is most of the time, and temperatures, but it coincides with our flowering period. The other disease, which actually happens when things are a little bit cooler and drier, is called powdery mildew. And you'll see the picture there on the right, and you see that gray silvery color, that's the powdery mildew. So, and it's a little bit, that happens when things are cooler and drier, and you're like, well, you know, I thought we only had problems when it was hot and humid and rainy. No, actually you can have powdery mildew destroy the flowers and not get any fruit either. Lastly, I'm showing you a picture of scab. All of these can be controlled with some judicious use of fungicides. However, if you don't want to use fungicides, again, opening up the tree to light and air movement is going to be key to allowing those panicles and flowers and fruit to dry off quickly and reduce the amount of disease. And I think probably the biggest problem most homeowners have is getting the fruit set. Once set, they generally, you know, don't have a huge problem, but can depending on rainfall. Okay, and here I'm talking about another disease, which fortunately is not down here. It's not in Miami-Dade County yet. It is a bacteria that spreads by wind-driven rain and infected propagation material. Having, you know, some windbreaks where the tree is not in a super windy area, and sometimes the use of some copper fungicides can reduce the incidence of this. But what we've done here is listed susceptible, moderately susceptible, and resistant varieties. So if it turns out you have this disease in your area, you want to pay attention to this. And we have a fact sheet that has a lot more detail on this bacterial black spot. And as I mentioned, it's not in Miami-Dade yet that we know of. So what can you do? For the anthracnose, you want to try to go varieties that have some tolerance or less susceptible to anthracnose. For powdery mildew, you want to pay attention to the weather. And if it looks like we're having cool, dry weather during the bloom, you may want to apply sulfur 1 or 2 times, and that will take care of the powdery mildew. Red algae, which attacks the leaves mostly and the shoots, you can apply copper maybe twice, once in June, once in August. The bacterial black spot, again, copper would be used, but the best thing would be to grow varieties that are resistant to it. Again, avoid crowding. You want trees to be far enough away that it allows for full sun exposure and air movement. You want to selectively prune the trees to maintain or reestablish the canopy light exposure and wind movement through the trees. Remember, trees that are opened up, dry out much faster. You do want to contact your county extension service if you need advice on some of these. Mango malformation. We don't see a lot of this. It's caused by a fungus that lives in the shoots. However, it can be spread by pruning instruments, and also through infected nursery stock, and like I said, pruning with contaminated equipment. And the big thing about it is it reduces fruit set dramatically. And on the top, you see a normal panicle facing us. On the bottom, this is the distorted panicle that's typical of mango malformation. If you see this, best thing to do is to go back 3 feet from the base of the panicle and remove it, and then dispose of it, double bag it and dispose of it. Then you want to go ahead and clean off the pruning tools before you prune anything else. Otherwise, you just spread it. We don't see much of that. Some of the insect pests, you have thrips. They can sometimes be a problem at high populations. At lower populations, they may not be a problem. In fact, they may do some pollination, but at high populations, they can be a problem. There are some biocontrol and some soft materials that can help if the thrip population is too high. I just want to remind you, though, I would not suggest applying these unless it's really apparent that the thrips are doing damage. Why? Because you may end up killing other pollinators that are pollinating the flowers. 2 materials. One is called Mycotrol, Beauveria bassiana. It's a fungus. It's spores that can that kills some insects, including thrips, but it also can harm honeybees and other flying insects. Pyganic is a natural pyrethrum, but again, as I said, you could end up damaging or killing off your pollinators. So you have to be very careful, especially during flowering. There are many kinds of scales that attack the leaves, mostly. And so if you see them, you can control them with horticultural oils. And basically what you're doing is suffocating the scale. Be careful, though, during high temperatures. So if we're in the 90s, I would not recommend applying oil because it might be somewhat toxic to the plant at high air temperatures. So we also sometimes get mites and red-banded thrips, which attack the leaves. You want to monitor for those, and if you do need to control them, you can use sulfur. And as I mentioned, the thrip control would be the Beauveria or Mycotrol and Pyganic, something like that. One thing you want to do is be monitoring your trees before they begin to flower, because if they have scales, then that would be the time to treat for them before they flower. The same with the red-banded thrips and with the mites. they may be a problem. So you want to be monitoring before the tree flowers. If they need to be controlled then, control them then. And then that way you don't have to do anything during flowering. Mealy bugs can sometimes be a problem. They can be easily controlled with a biocontrol called Botanigard. Also, again, highly refined oils can suffocate them. Again, you have to be careful about when you do this because during high temperatures, you could end up causing damage. Whiteflies, similarly, they can attack the tree and weaken the tree. You could purchase some parasitoids which colonize and parasitize the whiteflies. And you can buy some of these online. There's also several materials, Azigard and Azisol, which can be used as well. Some disorders. Mango decline is a nutritional disorder. And then internal breakdown is when the pulp of the fruit has some type of softening or cavities or things like that. Here's mango decline, and it's a minor element deficiency. So you don't want your trees to get to this stage. And that's why I would recommend you do fertilize them properly. This is some of the internal breakdown symptoms. Some of you have probably seen this before. We think this is a calcium deficiency, but we have not been able to stop it. How bad it gets is somewhat genetically predetermined, but also apparently there's some nutritional aspect to it as well. Fruit splitting, this can occur when the fruit is developing and we have drought conditions and the trees aren't watered at all. And what happens is the peel stops being able to grow, but the pulp can swell with water, with the tissue can swell, and you'll get a rainfall or something. The tree takes up a lot of water, the cells and the pulp continue to expand, the peel can't, and it splits the fruit. Let's see if there's harvest. So when do you harvest? So generally, when the shoulders are broad, the cheeks are completely pushed out, the apex or the nose of the fruit is blunt, right? That's a typical way to look. Another way is to take a few fruit and open them up. As you see here, if it has some yellow color near the seed, this fruit will go ahead and ripen. Now, of course, this one is more mature on the tree. This will be somewhat higher quality than this one, right? Because this one has accumulated a lot more sugars than this one at this stage, but these both will ripen. But if you open this up and it's white, that fruit is not mature and it's not going to ripen well or at all. Okay, so you want some color, yellow color near the peel. That's another way to tell. Post-harvest, you want to pick them carefully. You only want to put ripe fruit in the refrigerator. If you put just mature fruit that's not ripe in the refrigerator, you're basically going to kill it and it's not going to ripen properly. So it wants to ripen at about 70, 75 degrees. This is just a little bit on some of the nutritional value. Mangoes also have antioxidants and phenols, which are involved in human health as well. More information on IFAS at an IFAS extension. There's also Ask IFAS is another same thing as Solutions for Your Life, and the EDIS website. This is our website at the Research Center. This is the Florida State Hort Society website, which also has information. And so this is the fact sheet I spoke about. So that's available online as well. And with that, I'll stop.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Crane. That was wonderful. I think you touched on a lot of questions that folks probably had, and a fantastic overview of mango production. So thank you.
Sure.
We do have a couple questions in the chat. I can read off to you.
Sure.
Yeah, folks, if you have questions at this point, feel free to drop them in the chat and we will get to them. One person says, hi, Dr. Crane, we're home growers here who moved into a house with already established mangoes. Only 3 produced this year, though, probably because of the flowering like you talked about earlier in the presentation. Also, the trees have anthracnose. So many of the trees are really tall, probably because they're not pruned early on. Any wisdom or, anything you can share about cutting down trees versus keeping them and sort of troubleshooting, this is a great question.
Yeah, and we do a lot in urban landscapes. You'll find these trees that are, 20, 30, 40 feet high that were planted a long time ago. And yes, and so the fruit production is way up in the tree and you've lost the lower canopy. Very difficult to manage the tree. So there are several options. One is to hire a certified and insured arborist and have them work with you on a plan to bring the size of that tree down. And part of that is not only to try to reestablish or maintain the production somewhat lower in the tree, but also because of the potential for hurricane damage, not just to the tree, but to any structures such as your home that are nearby. So you can bring trees down. It's a dangerous operation. So that's why I'm saying you want to hire somebody that is an arborist. They have a license, they can prove it. They're also insured so that if they are hurt, their insurance takes care of this. You really have to pay attention to that. And definitely you don't want to be climbing a tree with a chainsaw. That's just unacceptable. I mean, it's just so dangerous. Another option is if these are, arborists cost money, right? But also, removing a large tree that, you don't want a tree just for its shade is an option. But again, that takes money and expertise to do. There is something called rejuvenation, which is a more drastic pruning of the tree. Again, with that, you need to make sure your county or the area where you live, that there's no regulations about how severely you can prune a tree. In some areas, you're not allowed to quote unquote hat rack or stump a tree. It's against the local ordinances. So you need to check all that out first. And again, if you were going to do something like that, you would want a professional to come in and do that. And you want to whitewash the tree beforehand because it can sunburn and there's things involved. So, those are some of the options. None of them are perfect. But really the only way to establish production lower in the canopy, again, is to bring the tree way down. Again, working with an arborist, you may be able to do that in a safe way.
Yeah, so it seems like a different approach and it could take some time.
Yes.
Okay, great. Ben wants to know copper instead of magnesium in the micronutrients section, maybe. I'm not sure maybe you can put some clarification in the chat and we can get back to that question. We have a couple questions about fertilizers. So Ro wants to know, with regard to the fertilizer you mentioned, NPK, magnesium, to use either 8.3 or 9.3. How will that read on the package? So for example, will it be 8.8.8 and then also have a 3 of magnesium? So can you talk about what folks should look for?
Right. Yeah. So a couple of things about the fertilizer that you can buy. As I was mentioning to you, mangoes in general are a low nitrogen type tree. You don't want to be applying a lot of nitrogen. They don't need a lot of nitrogen, and you get a better tree if you don't use a whole lot. So what I generally do is you can buy, so you have generally 3 numbers on the label. So let's just say 839. So the 8 is the percent nitrogen in the fertilizer. The 3 is the percent phosphate or phosphorus, P2O. And then the potassium is the 3rd number. Okay. And so that's typical. You'll see 666, 839, 10-12, things like that, right? You can use any of those materials, but the amount you use will vary. So if you were using 666, and most of the time people base how much fertilizer they're going to put on based on the nitrogen number, the first number. So let's say I was going to use this tree was appropriate size, I was going to use 1 pound of the 666. But if I'm using the 839, I would probably use 3/4 of a pound. If I was going to use the 10-2-12, I'd use a 1/2 pound. Do you see what I mean? Because it's more concentrated. Okay. So you can use, small amounts of those, what we would call a complete fertilizer. Now, many times you have to read the bag, the label on the bag, sorry. And there may be a 4th number on the bag, or it may not be written in big numbers like 839. And the next number after that would be the magnesium content in the bag. But if it doesn't list it, you can still look on the bag. It may have magnesium in the fertilizer already. And so how available that magnesium is depends on the type of soil you have. If it's a high pH soil, very calcareous, like the lime rock that we have here in Miami-Dade and other areas, that magnesium may not be too available. There's really nothing you can do about that. I mean, if you're buying 839 and it has magnesium in it, you can still go ahead and fertilize with it. It's not a problem. You're going to want to apply the magnesium in your micro element mix along with your micro element mix, which you can buy these mixes. Some of them are liquid most of the time, that are already made pre-mixed. You just have to add water. And you can buy those online. Sometimes they're at the garden stores. You want to read the labels and follow the label if it's a foliar micronutrient, and a lot of times it has this secondary nutrient in it, magnesium, and you can apply that foliar to the leaves. So for example, it will be 888 and then also have 3 of mag. Yeah, so you need to read the label of the fertilizer label. The only other thing I would tell you about when you buy fertilizers from the garden stores, you want to look at the label for the chlorine content. Mangoes are sensitive to chlorine. In other words, chlorine is somewhat toxic to mangoes. So the label, any of the fertilizer you buy, the dry fertilizers, it should have 2% or less chlorine content. If it has more than 2%, you probably want to find another formulation or something that has 2% or less chlorine, because chlorine is toxic to mango trees.
That's interesting. How about like if you use city water?
Yeah.
Do you know the concentration of chlorine in there, or?
Off the top of my head, I don't.
Yeah, okay.
But I've not
That's an interesting point.
Yeah, at least in our area, the city water, I haven't seen a problem with chlorine. But that's a good point. You might want to check with your city water source to see what the percent chlorine is.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Megan would like to know, can you do an iron treatment at the same time as a general granular fertilizer?
Yeah, so that's interesting. That's a good point, because the other thing you want to look at when you look at the fertilizer label is it will a lot of times, it has to tell you not only that it is, let's say, 8% nitrogen, but what is that nitrogen from? Is it from ammonium nitrate, potassium nitrate? What is the source of that nitrogen? The other thing it will tell you generally is what percent of these elements are in organic or slow release form, and what percent are more rapidly available. And so that brings up a good point. In some cases, it may be better for you to buy a slow release fertilizer like Osmocote, and there's a number of different brands that slowly release nutrients over time. So you might only have to, and you have to read the label of the material, you might only have to apply it once every 3 months instead of every other month, or once every 7 months. And again, you have to read the label on how much to put for a big tree. And then the iron treatment. Yeah, so what I'm getting at originally was that the granular materials in general have a slow release component and a quick release component. So if I apply it to the tree, it's going to slowly dissolve. And if it's a slow release material, even more slowly dissolve. And so you could go ahead and do an iron soil drench at the same time, whether it's over the dry fertilizer or before the dry fertilizer. Either way, you could do it. So it's not going to be any big deal, because with the soil drench, you would mix the iron with the water, pour it around the tree, and you would probably take another bucket full of just clean water and pour that on top, because you want that iron to move into the roots, into where the root system is. And if there's dry fertilizer on top of the soil, that's not a big deal. Where the caution comes is that if you use a fertilizer that is nothing but soluble fertilizer, you know what I mean, highly soluble, you put it out today, this morning, and then we get a ½ inch of rain, it's basically washed down through. That's why I would recommend using a more slow granular material at least, or a granular that's a slow release.
Okay.
Less likely to push the nutrients below the root system.
Okay. Bob would like to know that he says, I often hear the benefits of potassium, magnesium as an alternative to nitrogen fertilizer, especially closer to flowering. Is there any real benefit to this approach?
Yes, yes, and I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, so what I usually do is, if the trees have had, you know, a big crop last year, or they look like they're going to have a really big crop, I will apply potassium, so a 0,0 potassium, so potassium sulfate, some kind of potassium magnesium sulfate, something like that. And you can buy materials that are 0,0, 20, 0,0, 22. I wouldn't buy potassium chlorate, which is 0,050. Why? Because it's got chlorine in it, a high percentage of chlorine. But one of the other potassium sources, so it's usually 20, 21% potassium. And yes, I would make separate applications of that. I usually do an application of that after the harvest. Why? Because when I harvest the fruit, I'm taking a lot of potassium from the tree, right, in the fruit. So I'm replenishing the potassium, and I will also apply it after fruit set in the spring for the developing fruit that year. So usually twice a year. If I am going to apply nitrogen, in general, I would do that. It depends on how big a crop load I've had. Do that, you know, after the harvest. Like, so as an example, if I have a large 15-foot tree, I might put 1 pound of 839, but I'll put 2 pounds of the 0,020. Do you see what I mean? So I know you're getting some potassium with the 839, but the 0,020 is you know, going to apply much more, which is a lot of potassium is taken from the tree when you harvest the fruit.
Okay. And what age or maturity do you start treating with iron?
Yeah, you want to start treating the trees with iron from when you plant them. Yeah, from when they're young. And just, you know, the main thing is pay attention to what the label rates are for it, of these chelated materials. And like I said, you can buy them from some stores. The chelated materials you might have to buy online. I did mention one that was called Sequestrine 138. There's some others as well. And you want to use small amounts. You know, it's always better to go light than too heavy, because if it's too light of an application, you can always apply more. If you apply way too much, now you've damaged the tree, and now you're in, you know, trying to get the tree's health back.
Is bacterial spot in Collier County or other counties around the area?
Well, we have not gotten any samples that verify this. We suspect, unfortunately, we suspect it's probably already in most of the counties in South Florida. So far, you know, we've documented it's in Palm Beach County.
Yeah.
We haven't documented if it's down here, but we suspect it may be. We just it hasn't reached a point where we're seeing it. But I can tell you that list and that fact sheet we have on bacterial spot, I would pay attention to that, especially if that disease gets introduced, because it's going to make growing some varieties almost impossible.
Yeah, and I will send that fact sheet over to everyone so you can take a look. I haven't heard or seen of it yet, but I think I have seen it in Lee County. But again, you can't I haven't confirmed that. So, but if for those of you that are growing it out there, please do look at that fact sheet and report back to us if you think you are dealing with that. So Ben wants to know, are RKN ever a concern to mangoes?
What is RK?
I'm not sure what RKN. Maybe Ben, you can plop it in the chat and we can get back to you. Jan wants to know, how can I get seedlings to have a thicker stem?
Well, I know in some nursery situations, and we see this, where the trees are grown, in such a protected way from all wind movement, that they're bamboo staked, and you take the bamboo stake off, and the stem falls over, and that's because it's been grown in such a still environment that the tree isn't induced to produce lignin, which stiffens the cells and the stem. And so, having a little bit of wind movement is not a bad thing. It's like a little bit of a stress response to the wind moving it around. And that should help make the stem, thicker. The other thing, of course, it has to do with the inherited genetic vigor of the seedling. And that's part of the reason why people use, turpentine or turpentine-like mangoes as rootstocks, because they tend to produce vigorous, large seedlings. So it could be that. It depends on your source of seeds.
Yeah, and as you're saying, I want to remind people to not keep those stakes on too long. Sometimes we see, the tree is like getting strangled by those nursery stakes. So yeah, take those out when you plant the tree.
Yeah, and sometimes people, when they plant their tree, they'll bury the tine at the base of the tree. You want to be sure to undo that before you plant the tree so you don't bury it.
Yeah. Twyla would like you to just remind everyone when the best time to fertilize is.
Yeah, so in general, we think of it as sometime between about March through September, October. Why? That's the warmer part of the year when the root system especially is active and can actually take up water and nutrients easily. Once we get into the winters, if the temperatures get too cool, the tree stops transpiring or stops being able to take up nutrients easily. So that's why we generally say during this warmer part of the year. Now, as you know, the climate's been changing, so it may come to pass that we won't have to worry about what time of year too much. But again, you want that tree to, you don't want to be applying nitrogen fertilizers in the late summer and fall. Why? Because you're going to stimulate that tree to grow. And remember, if you want that tree to flower, it needs to go dormant during the winter, the fall and the winter. So.
Okay. Yeah, good reminder. Cheryl wants to know, is CAC a good variety? I'm not sure what that is, but maybe you do.
Jack. Yeah. I'm not that familiar. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not that familiar with that variety. I have it actually as a young tree in our collection, but I'm not that familiar with it. So I can't really tell you.
Yeah, there's always some interesting varieties out there. That's one of the fun things when we go on these visits on home landscapes, backyard folks, they've always got really interesting stuff back there. Michael says, thanks for this very thorough presentation. Looking to buy a grafted ice cream mango tree. Any suggestions for recognized or trusted places to purchase in Broward County or Miami-Dade?
Yes. So I can actually, Jessica, I can send you a nursery list.
That would be great.
Yeah, and there's a number of nurseries that you can buy trees from that you can trust. Yes.
Is that just for your part of Florida, or does that include?
That includes, yeah. So, yeah. So this is both from, I'd say, from Palm Beach County, Miami-Dade, Lee County.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so there's a number of counties where these nurseries are located. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I will send that to me and we'll get it out to the group. Sanjay says, hi, Dr. Crane. Thanks for your time and knowledge that you've shared to us. So Jan wants to know, we are not allowed in our area to fertilize June through the end of September. So how do we do that? Do we do it through slow release or some other way?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I know that there's new fertilizer restrictions, especially for home landscapes. And so that does pose, pose a challenge. Fortunately, mango trees are not, huge users of, need for a lot of fertilizer. Yes, you could use slow release material. So go ahead and apply that before the restriction kicks in.
Okay.
I don't know if the restriction includes all the elements. I know certainly phosphorus and probably nitrogen. My recollection is those are the two main ones, but you need to look carefully at the regulation. If you're allowed to use the minor elements as a foliar spray, then you could continue to do that. It would be the restrictions on the materials to the ground. And in that case, you want to buy a high quality, slow release material.
Okay. Christina's got a great question. So she says, do the Florida commercial mango growers only grow or sell mangoes? Or do they also sell other crops as well? And are their mangoes mostly sold in Florida? Are they shipped throughout the US? Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. No, so the mangoes are not just sold in Florida. They're actually sold nationally. And how far out nationally they go depends on the grower, the supplier, whether they're going through internet sales, and then, therefore some kind of postal service in the US, or whether they're going through a packing house or a farmer's market. So, or what, but yeah, they're being sold all over the US. Our industry, really, the commercial industry, is really not trying to compete with the larger industries, let's say from Mexico and Brazil. We can't compete. But our industry is more focused on growing what we would call specialty mangoes. So these are varieties that you don't get normally in the big grocery stores, right? So these are specific varieties that the big players internationally are not going to grow and send to the US. And so they sell them, like I said, through the internet or personally, through direct sales or through selected markets that they have a relationship with, usually not the big chains because they don't have the volume, right? But more to people who are connoisseurs of mangoes or who know mangoes. And as I said, internet sales has really increased dramatically because people want very specific varieties. And then also buy local. That happens a lot too.
Yeah, and to echo that, the smaller producers that I work with that work with tropical fruit, they often will grow other varieties or other types of tropical fruit. And like Dr. Crane's saying, they can really target folks that are looking for something very specific, whether it's for cultural, what they grew up with, or culturally what they like to eat. And yeah, the direct to market is a really interesting and growing section of mangoes and tropical fruit, at least that we're seeing here.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. Most producers grow more than one thing. They're not just growing mango. There are a few, but mostly they're multi-cropping. Yeah, different crops.
Yeah. What value does azomite give?
Do not know because I'm not sure what azomite is.
Yeah. Give us some more information in the chat. You guys are stumping us this morning. Bob wants to know, when is the best time to tip? And can it be done when fruiting?
Yeah, so the best time to tip. So generally what we're saying is that you plant a new mango tree or you have a young mango tree, relatively young. And you tip it the first 2 years, like if it's a newly planted tree. So during the first 2 years, you would want to tip any branch on the tree that has grown 2 flushes. So, it puts out 1 flush and it stops for a while, which is usually, anywhere from 6 to 12 inches long. Puts out a second flush, which may reach, up to 18 to 24 inches. Once it hits that 18 to 24 inch, go ahead and cut the tip off of that. And what will happen is the buds and the axils below that where you've tipped it will push out new shoots and make new branches. And if you do that to wherever, walking by your tree at any time and you see that there's shoots that have grown twice, that are of the grown twice, and you tip that and do that for the first 2 years, you're going to increase the bushiness, the branching of that tree. You could do it. Well, let me put it this way. If part of your tree has fruit, you probably don't want to tip that, right? Because you're going to tip off the fruit. But on the other branches on that tree, you could go ahead and tip those and it'll force them to branch.
Okay, thank you. Irene wants to know, how much calcium do the trees need, when to apply it, and in what form, and is gypsum the same as calcium?
Yeah, gypsum has calcium. It has calcium and magnesium. In general, okay, so in our area here, that is basically calcareous soil. It's just calcium-laden soil. We generally don't recommend people apply calcium. But if you are in an area that calcium can be, or limestone can be advantageously applied to the soil, remember, okay, so how quickly available calcium is to a tree depends on the size of the particles of calcium you're applying. So if you're applying something like slaked limestone or something like that, it's almost like a powder. You apply that and water it into the soil. It's going to take a while for that to become available, dissolve. So it might take, a number of months, right? But if you use limestone that is sort of like a granular fertilizer, moderately large chunks of calcium, it's going to take even longer. So you apply the fertilizer today, it's not going to have a reaction to the tree for 6, 12 months. So it would be something where you would apply it now and you would expect the benefit from it in the future. But again, it depends also how much calcium is already in your soil. So if your soil is calcium based, like it is in the Keys and it is here and other parts of Florida, applying calcium may be of no benefit. But I do know, for instance, some places in Palm Beach County to our north, other places where the pH is not much above 7, or their calcium level in the soil is not that high, applying calcium can have some benefit, especially in preventing some of the internal breakdown of the fruit, of the pulp. So you could do that. But again, you're planning for it for next year to have the reaction, not this year.
Yeah, that's a great point. Cheryl wants to know, so she said, I may have missed this, but why is iron good for mango trees?
Okay. So yeah, that's a good question. Most plants, just like we require certain elements to be healthy. There's 16, maybe 17 now, elements that are required for a healthy plant. She was mentioning calcium, am I right? Or
Iron.
Iron.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and iron, sire. Iron was one of them. And so the reason they're called essential elements is because the plant can't easily, the plant isn't totally healthy and can't complete all its biochemistry and all the cycles that go on in photosynthesis and respiration without these elements. And so iron is one of them. Iron is important for a lot of enzyme systems and other biochemical reactions in the plant. If the plant's deficient in it and it gets bad enough, the plant can actually die back. And you'll see yellow leaves with green veins. The leaves will be small. If it gets really severe, the leaves come out and they're almost white. And the tree's not going to flower. It's not going to fruit well. It's just going to decline. So you would say it's essential because without it, that tree is not going to thrive. It's not going to produce well.
Okay. So we have some clarification here too. So is there root knot nematode susceptibility in different varieties?
Yeah, periodically over the years, that's been a concern of nematodes on mangoes. And we do find some nematode population in mango groves. But in general, we've not found it to be at such a level of population to be of concern, that it's causing a big reaction. That's quite different than, let's say, with guavas, where nematode populations can be high and make it almost impossible to grow a guava tree. Mangoes, we haven't seen it be a big problem. If you suspect you have a problem, you could sample the roots and take them to extension and have somebody send them, or you could send them to the nematode lab and see, or to one of the diagnostic clinics, and they could probably give you a better feel whether you're having a true problem or not. So yeah, you would see the root knots, you would see the nodules, you would see the issue, the tree would be declining. But like I said, we generally find several different species of nematodes in and around the root system, but not to the level that's a big problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess keeping healthy soil too will help with that.
Exactly.
Those, like Dr. Crane's saying, those other nematodes will outcompete the root knot if there is any. Question about Sri Lankan weevil. I'm sure lots of folks have seen this in the landscape. I certainly do. Do you treat them, and especially in young trees?
Yeah. In this area, we don't see much of a problem with the Sri Lanka weevil. Now, outside of Miami-Dade, I have seen where it's been a problem occasionally. They're a hard thing to, we see more damage, with Sri Lanka weevil on mangoes and longans, things like that, outside of Miami-Dade County. So Palm Beach County, Lee County, places like that. I would have to look it up. There may be some things to control them periodically. I would say, for young trees, they're more of a problem than they are for a mature tree. So if you have young trees and they're just being defoliated constantly, yeah, you probably want to try to do something about it. If it's a big tree and it's just occasionally getting hit and not the whole tree, probably the tree is going to be okay. I'd have to look up to see what's registered legally to use in order to give you any advice. And again, there may be some materials you may have to have a license to actually use them. So it gets a little complicated. You can contact, the extension service and see. There are some sources online to tell you what actually is registered and legal and what may or may not work. One way, that's a mechanical way for a young tree is to just constantly go out and take an umbrella, turn it upside down, and shake the branches into the umbrella. One of the problems with the Sri Lanka weevils is that when it gets disturbed, it usually flies away. So even if you're spraying the tree, it's flying away or dropping to the ground as you spray. It's a difficult insect to control.
Okay, we've got about 4 minutes left and a couple more questions, so we'll try and get through these. William has a great question. I get calls about this quite a bit, actually. So he says, I have a kit mango tree, and there was a new tree that grew from a seed. I gave this tree to my neighbor. It's now about 5 years old, and it's about 10 feet high. It's never flowered or produced any fruit. Is there anything that you would recommend to do here?
Yeah. So the key thing is you just mentioned, so this was grown from a kit mango seed, which is monoembryonic. So it's not a kit mango, it's a seedling tree of unknown, we don't know who, we know who the mother is, we don't know who the father is. So the tree could be anything, have any quality. Typically, when you grow monoembryonic mangoes from seed, they will not flower and fruit, and it depends anywhere from 4 to about 7 or 8 years. So you may have a wait until this thing finally decides it's mature enough become adult, and can flower and fruit. So you could keep it, but you may have a wait, and then you won't know what the fruit's going to be like until it does flower and fruit. Another option is to top work it. In other words, graft on a desirable variety on top of that seedling rootstock and change what it is. Pick another variety and have it grafted to something else. And then again, who's going to do the grafting? Either, you could take grafting lessons. Sometimes they're offered through the extension service or with some other groups, fruit enthusiast groups, and learn how to graft and then attempt it yourself. In some cases, there may be somebody local who can do the top working for you to another variety. So there are some options, but you could wait. The other thing too is if it's 5 years old and about 10 feet high, you want to make sure you might want to top that tree, somewhere around 8 feet or so to try to make it bushy and branch out. That will also help slow it down. Remember, plants go through juvenile phases just like animals, where they're incapable of flowering and fruiting. And that's why it takes, 4 to 8 years before they're mature enough to actually flower and fruit. But by pruning them and forcing them to branch, you may reduce the time that it slows down and matures, by a couple of years maybe. But you'll have a much more bushy tree by the time it does flower and fruit. A lot of times the seedlings just grow long shoots, and they're just really hard to control.
Yeah, we have, if you're in Collier County, the Collier County Tropical Fruit Growers meet at our extension office Thursday mornings. Roger Taylor, Crafton Cliff meets there. We call him Grafton, right? They can teach you a lot about grafting if that's something that you're interested in. So you can get in touch with me and I'll connect you with them, but they meet Thursday mornings. I do want to be respectful of our time. So for those of you that need to log off, please feel free. We do have 2 questions left, if you wouldn't mind answering those, Dr. Crane. So one is, should we continue to tip older trees? What about tipping non-growing branches? And great presentation.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. Yeah, you can tip older trees if you want them to have more branching. Sure, it's not going to harm anything. Just remember that once you, on older trees, once you start pruning back shoots that are more than about an inch and a half in diameter, that there is the potential that when it sets out new shoots from those lateral buds below it, if the size of the stem was an inch and a half thickness or greater, it may put out more than one vegetative flush. So it may trigger it to come out, grow and flush, wait for a while, grow and flush, wait for a while, grow and flush, right? Whereas if you're pruning something that's an inch and a half or less in diameter, it will probably go ahead and grow and then settle down and then potentially flower the next year. Whereas if it's too thick of a branch, it may not flower the following year, right? It may take a while for it to slow down. So yeah, you can tip these non-growing branches as well if you want to. One thing you can also do, and I'm sure you've noticed, again, if you're controlling the size of your tree, this makes all things much easier.
Yeah.
And I'm sure people have noticed, you'll have a big mango tree. Part of the mango tree is putting out new leaves. Part of it flowered and fruited. Part of it is dormant. One way to synchronize the whole tree so it behaves synchronously the same, in other words, it flowers all at the same time, it fruits at the same time, it grows vegetatively at the same time, is to tip all the shoots. Of course, that can be a daunting task on a 15-foot tree, right? To tip every single shoot. And again, I wouldn't recommend climbing ladders and things like that, but maybe with a pole saw. But that's, not something that's generally done, especially in the home landscape. Commercially, in general, there are small commercial plantings where people do all the pruning by hand, and that works. And then many of the larger commercial plantings, they use big machines to come in and prune the trees. So they prune them mechanically. So that's different than in the home landscape.
Okay, thank you. And our final question we have is, how much boron do we need to apply, and in what format? Is a spray okay?
So a spray is okay. However, I would suggest not buying boron separately. That you buy the boron as part of a nutritional mix that's already been made. There are different minor element foliar spray mixes that you can sometimes find them in the garden stores. You can also find them online, and they contain usually secondary elements like magnesium and potassium, or as a primary element, but also the minor elements, which includes boron. The reason I'm being cautious about boron is because the difference between a toxic amount of boron being applied and a sufficient amount is very close. And so you don't want to OD your tree on boron. So I wouldn't recommend buying boron separately and then trying to put it on the tree. As an example, it's usually the boron rate is 1/300th of the amount of nitrogen. So, you know, why not just buy a minor element mix that already has boron in it at a very low concentration, and it's a safe way to apply it.
Okay, thank you. And okay, well, that's all the time we have here today. Unfortunately, I know could have more questions come in, and this was a wonderful presentation. There's lots of information and thanks here in the chat to you, Dr. Crane, Dr. Crane, excuse me. Sincerely appreciate the depth of the knowledge and discussion, amazing information. So thank you so much for taking the time on your weekend to share this with us. And for those of you that are on the call today, I will send out an email with this presentation, some resources we talked about, and a survey. So thank you again, Dr. Crane, and everyone enjoy the rest of your Saturday.
Thank you.